Hello and welcome to the RealTime Fantasy Sports Show. I'm Jeff Paur, senior writer with RealTime Fantasy Sports. And on today's RealTime Fantasy Sports Show, I'm going to give you my starts, sits, and sleepers for week 3 of the fantasy football season. It was a little better week last week in terms of fantasy production, a lot more scoring, a lot more high-scoring games as well, which is always good for us fantasy owners to see. As for me, I'm going to tell you, I'm going to keep my track of my wins and losses here for these quarterback start, sits, sleepers, running back, receiver, and tight end. I went 14-12 last week, exact same as week 1. And in full transparency, I gave myself a loss for the quarterback sit of Brock Purdy. I did not think that he was going to sit that game when I made the video, but he ended up sitting, so I couldn't give myself a win. Gave myself a loss, which made me 14-12. Hopefully I do a little better this week. Not too bad, though, being over 500. That's all you want. I'm hoping to shoot more of that 60%, 70% correct guesses on my part. So let's get started. Let's go into the start, sits, and sleepers for this week. I'm going to start at QB. I give you 3 starts, 3 sits, and then a sleeper. And then for the tight end position, not quite as deep. I give you 2 starts, 2 sits, and a sleeper there. We start at QB as always, and my first start is Dak Prescott of the Cowboys. Didn't do a whole lot in the opener, but he showed his potential this past week. He had 26.8 fantasy points in that game, and he attempted 52 passes against the Giants. He aired it out early and often. This is a pass-first offense, and he plays the Bears this week. They were just torched through the air last week by the Lions. Bears allow the most fantasy points to quarterbacks to start the season. I think Prescott keeps up his hot ways in this one. And speaking of the Bears, that's my next quarterback start, Caleb Williams. So he gets this Cowboys team that they allow the second most fantasy points to QBs. They couldn't stop Russell Wilson last week. That's all you need to know there. He is not the best fantasy QB out there. And Williams has actually been pretty good despite his struggles a little bit on the field. From a fantasy perspective, he's been just fine. He has top 20 fantasy points each of his first 2 games. I think the big plus here is the Cowboys don't have a great pass rush. So I think that's good news for Williams. He doesn't have to do his improvising thing where he makes bad decisions, runs around the pocket, and tries to make something that he shouldn't. So I think he has a lot of success against the Cowboys in week 3. My last start is Jared Goff of the Lions. He's coming off a 5 TD performance, played a tremendous game last week against the Bears team that I just mentioned. He gets the Ravens. They've struggled against the pass to start the season. They allow the 4th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. I think Goff keeps it going. He looked really comfortable last week, starting to get the feel of this new Lions offense. So I like Goff to keep it going. All right, here's my sits at QB. First one's a big name. It's tough to sit him, and I get it if you don't want to use probably a high draft pick on him, but just temper your expectations, and that's Jalen Hurts. This new Eagles offense, quite frankly, has looked really vanilla to start the season, and Hurts has taken few chances down the field. He's just 15th over on quarterback scoring. He has not attempted more than 23 passes in any of his first 2 games. So I think the Eagles can run the ball every snap and win games just behind their running game and their defense. So I don't know if Hurts is going to need to do a whole lot. He hasn't done a whole lot so far to start the season, and now he plays the Rams this week. They have not allowed more than 200 passing yards in any game this season, and they allow the fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks on the year. So I would steer clear of Hurts in this one if you can. My next sit at QB is Bryce Young of the Panthers. Numbers really looked good last week in the end, but quite frankly, he was terrible for 3 quarters. Didn't do a whole lot. He piled up those fantasy points late in the game when his team was trailing by a lot. But overall, I still have not been impressed with Young to start the season. Now he gets the Falcons. They've allowed the 4th fewest fantasy points to QBs, really done well against the quarterback this year, and they have not allowed more than 160 passing yards in their 2 games. So I'm worried about Young doing much and building on that big performance of last week. My last sit at QB is Kyler Murray of the Cardinals. He has played just fine to start the year overall, but from a fantasy perspective, not very good. He has yet to top 20 fantasy points in any of his 2 games. He gets the 49ers. They allow the 5th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks, have not allowed more than 190 passing yards in any game. I think Murray has another ho-hum performance here. All right, let's talk about sleeper at QB, and that for me is Drake May. I'm not sure he's going to be called a sleeper much longer. He's kind of moving into the mainstream, but for now, I'll leave him in that category. He had a really good game last week, scored 3 touchdowns, scored 28.6 fantasy points. He has at least 19.7 fantasy points each of his first two games. He gets the Steelers. They allowed 32 points in week 1 to the Jets, 31 points last week to the Seahawks. Neither of those offenses are very high powered. I think May can do well in this one. All right, let's look at running backs now. We start with the starts. And for the starts for this week at running back, my first one's Travis Etienne. A huge surprise for me this year. He's been really good, though. He ranks 9th overall in fantasy running back scoring after 2 games. He has 214 rushing yards through 2 games, averaging an impressive 7.1 yards per carry. Plays the Texans. They just allowed 169 rushing yards to the Bucs last week. They couldn't stop the run at all. I like Etienne again in this matchup. Alvin Kamara is another start for me at running back. He's been one of the few bright spots for the Saints offense. He's been racking up the touches, though. He had 27 his last game, and the Saints are playing kind of an up-tempo offense, so that gives them more plays each week, and that's good news for Kamara because he's really going to get the work. And he plays Seattle this week, who does do well against the pass, but not so much against the run. They allow the 3rd most fantasy points of running backs through 2 weeks of action. My last start at running back is Jordan Mason of the Vikings. Already looking good, and now Aaron Jones is out, so that means the backfield is all Masons. And the Vikings have really struggled to throw the ball to start the year, so I think they could take some pressure off their QB situation. Carson Wentz is likely to start this week for them, but I still think Mason gets a heavy workload against the Bengals, who have allowed the 2nd most fantasy points of running backs this year. I think he's a great play in this matchup. All right, let's look at 3 sits now at running back. My first sit is Josh Jacobs of the Packers. Again, he's a good player, and it's tough to sit someone of his caliber, but I just don't think he's been too impressive. He has touchdowns each of his first 2 games, which have overall just saved his fantasy production, quite frankly, because he hasn't done much besides that. He has just 1 catch in 2 games. I hate that. And his rushing totals have been so-so, and he plays the Browns this week. They just shut down Derrick Henry. The Browns have not allowed more than 50 rushing yards in a single game. I think Jacobs is going to be a touchdown-dependent play in this one. My next sit is Nick Chubb of the Texans. It was great to see Chubb finally find the end zone last week, broke a long run late in the game, but before that, really didn't do much. He had just 12 carries for 43 yards on the day. He plays the Jags. They held the Bengals to just 48 rushing yards last week. I'm still not very impressed with Chubb right now in the entire Texans offense, quite frankly, and I would steer clear of him. My last sit is J.K. Dobbins of the Broncos. He's been fine and consistent, but really nothing too special to start the year. He has yet to have more than 80 rushing yards in a game, and he gets the Chargers, who have yet to allow more than 100 rushing yards in a game, and they allow the 3rd fewest fantasy points of running backs. I think Dobbins is going to have a below-average performance in this one. All right, my sleeper at running back, that is Ray Davis of the Bills. This is a bit of a deep sleeper. He got more work last week after just getting a carry in the opener, but the Bills got up big in that game, and he ended up running 9 times for 24 yards. Not great numbers, but he got 9 carries, and I think he gets 9 carries this week against the lowly Dolphins. I think he can do some damage. Might find the end zone. Again, I think it could be a similar situation to last week for Davis. They get up big in that game against the Dolphins, give him some chances to run the clock out late in the game. All right, let's look at the receiver position. I'll give you 3 starts, 3 sits, and then a sleeper there. My start is Rome Odunze, my first start. He has been unbelievable to start the year. He's the go-to target for Caleb Williams. It's not DJ Moore. It's Odunze. He's 4th overall in fantasy receiver scoring. I think he's a must start at this point. He has touchdowns each of his first 2 games, 13 receptions on 20 targets. He gets the Cowboys. They couldn't stop the Giants' passing attack at all last week. Malik Neighbors ran wild in that secondary. Dallas allows the 3rd most fantasy points to receivers. My next start is Michael Pittman of the Colts. He was really held in check a little more last week after his huge week 1, but he still had 4 catches for 40 yards on 5 targets against one of the best corners in football, Patrick Surtain. He gets an easier matchup this week against the Texans. They allow the 5th most fantasy points to receivers. I think Pittman gets it going again. Don't get too discouraged over last week. My last start at receivers, Terry McLaurin of the Commanders. He got more looks last week, so that was encouraging after a really disappointing week 1. He had 9 targets compared to 4 in week 1. He seems on the verge of a breakout game, in my opinion, so why not this week? They play the Raiders. They allow the 4th most fantasy points to receivers. We know McLaurin's more than capable of the huge game. I think he could have it in week 3. All right, here's 3 sits at receiver. My first one's Chris Olave of the Saints. The good news for Olave is he has been racking up the targets. He has 23 in 2 games. but he has just 108 yards on his 13 catches. His yards are way down, and he has yet to find the end zone this year. I think this makes him a bit of a mediocre weekly play. And against the Seahawks this week, I think he could struggle a little bit to get it going. Seahawks very good against the pass, but they can't stop the run. Seattle has allowed the fewest fantasy points to receivers on the year, so I think it's going to be a heavy dose of Alvin Kamara in this matchup. All right, another sit for you is T. Higgins of the Bengals. Higgins found the end zone last week, but he has just 3 receptions each of his first 2 games. Now Jake Browning takes over, and he looked Jamar Chase's way early and often once he entered that game last week. The Vikings allow the 3rd fewest fantasy points to receivers. It's really tough to sit Higgins, but I would temper my expectations for him right now with Browning as his QB. My last sit is Courtland Sutton of the Denver Broncos. Just a catch for 6 yards on 4 targets last week. Just a really disappointing game. He has 67 yards in 2 games. He gets the Chargers this week. They've been good against the pass. They allow the 10th fewest fantasy points to receivers. I think Sutton could have another just mediocre performance in this one. Again, it's a tough to sit a player of his caliber. He's always capable of the big game, Sutton he is, but he has not done a whole lot to date, and I think he could keep it going in week 3. All right, my sleeper receiver is Calvin Austin of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Austin had just a catch last week after having 4 for 70 yards and a touchdown in week 1. Looked great in week 1. The good news for Austin, though, even in that game last week where he had just a catch, he actually played more snaps than DK Metcalf. 92% of the snaps for Austin. He gets that much work this week against the Patriots. He could have a huge game. They allowed at least 297 passing yards each of their first 2 games. I think the Steelers can have success throwing the ball here. Austin could be a really good sneaky play. All right, let's look at the tight end position. I'll give you 2 starts, 2 sits, and then a sleeper at tight end. My starts, I'm going to mention another Saint, and that's Juwan Johnson. I know they could struggle a little bit to throw the ball, but if they do throw it, I think it's going to be to Johnson. He's going to get a lot of work. He's second overall in fantasy tight end scoring after 2 games, 20 targets in 2 games. As I mentioned a couple times already, Seahawks are really good against the pass, but they struggle against the run. But when teams do throw the ball to the tight end, they have actually allowed the most fantasy points to tight ends this year. So I think Johnson could get some work, might not have a huge game, but I like his potential for a lot of receptions in this matchup. Another start for you at tight end is Kyle Pitts of the Atlanta Falcons. Not a great game last week, but he still had 4 catches for 37 yards, so that's a positive. If that's his floor, I'll take that all day long. He has 13 targets in 2 games. Now he gets the Panthers this week, a really good matchup for him. They allow the 3rd most fantasy points to tight ends. I'd feel good about using Pitts as my number 1 tight end this week. All right, here's 2 sits for you at tight end. My first one's Jatavion Sanders of the Panthers. He got it going last week. He had 7 catches on 9 targets, but he still has just 81 yards in 2 games. He's more of a matchup play, in my opinion, and a matchup this week against the Falcons is not a good one. They have allowed just 1.1 fantasy points to the tight end in 2 games. That's total. So they've completely shut down the tight end this year. I would not use Sanders in this matchup. All right, another sit for you is Jaguars tight end Brenton Strange. He is still yet the top double-digit fantasy points in a game. He is another matchup play similar to Sanders, in my opinion. And a game against the Texans is not a great one for him. They allow the 5th fewest fantasy points to tight end. They've been really good against the pass this year. They allow fewer than 200 passing yards. They allowed fewer than 200 passing yards to a really good Bucs passing game last week. That Texans passing game is not near that of the Bucs. So the Jaguars passing game is not near that of the Bucs, I should say. I think Strange is going to struggle to do much here. All right, my sleeper at tight end, a bit of a deep sleeper here. It's going to be A.J. Barner of the Seahawks. Kind of surprising to me, but he's been the tight end that's played the most for Seattle this year. He's played at least 85% of the snaps each of his first 2 games. He scored a touchdown last week, and he has a rush attempt each of his first 2 games. So he's getting some consistent looks. He's playing the Saints. They allow the 7th most fantasy points to tight end. If you're looking for a deep sleeper at tight end, might want to give Barner a shot this week. All right, those are my start, sits, and sleepers for week 3 of the fantasy season. Hope you have a lot of success this week, get a lot of wins for your teams, and you come out feeling good about your week 3. This has been Jeff Paur for RealTime Fantasy Sports. Have a great day.